All right, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us as we finish actually the spring edition of our 2026 ISAR Virtuaeolian seminar series. The organizers Andrew, Maddie, Philip, me, and all the other ISAR board members are excited to continue this Virtuaeolian tradition with Catherine, better known as Kat Fitzsimmons. And before I turn the microphone over to Andrew to introduce Kat, who's the structure of today's webinar. Please keep your microphone muted unless called on in the Q&A section. Please feel free to type any questions in the chat at any time, but we will wait until the end to read them aloud, or you can read them yourselves. This meeting is being recorded because some part of the ISAR community is asleep, and it will be shared with the ISAR community through our website and our YouTube channel. After the talk, there's some more news we would like to share with you, so please hang on till the end. And finally, we ask everyone to contribute to creating and maintaining a welcoming and respectful working environment that fosters diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Here's to Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Please welcome Kat Fitzsimmons. She is a quaternary geochronologist and geomorphologist who grew up rolling down dunes in southeastern Australia, and as she states herself, hasn't really stopped doing so. The only real difference is that now she also applies science to better understand dryland systems. She completed a PhD at the Australian National University, ANU, in 2007, and then moved to Germany in 2010 for a series of positions, including a professorship in Tübingen. 2 years ago, she returned to Melbourne, Monash University, where she is an associate professor at the Faculty of Science in the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment with myself and some other people in the audience. Her passion for fieldwork in dusty and sandy places has taken her to remote Australia, Eastern Europe, and even County Kerry in Ireland. In addition, she's carried out dusty studies along the Silk Road, which we'll talk about today. Kat has already published more than 100 papers in leading international journals, which were cited more than 3,500 times. Welcome, Kat. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Jan Berend, for inviting me. The impact of an increasingly unpredictable future climate on our landscapes, the land on which we grow our food, our water supplies, our ecosystems, is arguably even less well understood than our models for climate itself. One thing that we can agree on is that conditions in marginal regions, like the edges of deserts, where Aeolian processes often dominate, will become increasingly unstable and unable to support human populations. And since the drylands of the world occupy 50% of the world's land masses and host 40% of the world's human population, this increasing instability will become a major concern for the future. This challenge highlights the urgent need to understand the climatic mechanisms impacting on dryland landscapes. Records of past change and a better understanding through Aeolian processes may help us in this quest by informing us about changing states and their manifestation on the land surface. It's no secret that we're living under conditions of accelerating global change. Now, under these conditions, the overall dryland area is set to increase substantially by the end of this century, placing up to 2 billion people under severe water and resource stress if warming rises by 4 degrees, as we can see on the right-hand side here. These model-based visualizations that are pictured here help us emphasize the importance of better understanding the interactions between the Earth's surface and the atmosphere. And it begs the question, what sorts of landscape responses might the future hold? Now, in order to understand trajectories of future change, we need to understand the nature of past change. We need to have an understanding of what kind of landscape is possible. And we also need to have an appreciation of the kinds of landscapes which represent different kinds of climatic states which have been inherited from past conditions. So what I show here is 2 maps. One is showing the present day situation in the world versus the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago. Now, what most people tend to focus on is on the extent of the ice sheets or the decrease in sea level during the last glacial maximum. But what I'd like to highlight here is the extent of the extreme deserts of the world. And if you'd like to just focus on Central Asia, sorry, I'm on a different screen here. So this region here, what we can see is that the extreme deserts of Central Asia were vastly expanded on what we see in the present day. And that, of course, begs the question, what might be the thresholds for reactivating these desert landforms? Arid Central Asia is the epicentre of the famed Silk Road. It's a great place to work too. Best watermelons you'll ever taste. Amazing people. But it's also a prime example of a region which is dominated by Aeolian landforms, but where the interactions between those landforms, Aeolian processes and climatic influences remains poorly understood. So today I'd like to explore some of our recent insights into those interactions in the dune fields and the loess settings of Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. To get your bearings, Central Asia lies in the centre of the Eurasian continent. It lies in the rain shadow of the Asian high mountains. We'll go back to this slide in a second, but I'd also like to emphasise here that it's a region which is characterised by steep topographic and climate transitions. So radiating outwards from those mountains, which are respectively known as the Tian Shan, the Alai, the Zarafshan and the Pamir, the landscape transitions from subhumid loess Piedmont, which is pictured here as an example from Tajikistan, to alufans, to desert dune fields, in some cases within a matter of only tens of kilometres. So as such, Arid Central Asia provides an excellent natural laboratory for investigating Aeolian processes and the interactions between landforms. So the climate of this region is not only highly variable, but it's also important for understanding atmospheric dynamics on the world's largest and most populous continent, Eurasia. So Arid Central Asia lies at the transition between the Asian monsoons, as you can see as the arrows from the East Asian and the Indian monsoons to the south, the mid-latitude westerlies, which transport moisture from the North Atlantic, and high-altitude polar fronts, which is associated with the Siberian high-pressure system. The Asian high mountains, which you can see here in this DEM, play a critical role in influencing the dynamics of those climate subsystems. Now, whilst the diversity of the Central Asian landscape and climate is clearly acknowledged, the nature of the interaction between the land surface and the atmosphere is generally poorly understood. Now, given the arid nature of the region, Aeolian landscapes are particularly widespread, and as we can see in these photos, both from my fieldwork. So this leads us to the central question of this talk. How do Silk Road Aeolian sediments relate to wind regimes and climate over time and space? The key piece of evidence of this is Aeolian sediments. So I'm presenting to you a talk in two parts. Firstly, what sort of information can we extract from sand dunes regarding the interaction between near-surface winds, climate and geomorphology? So looking at Aeolian sediment information across space. Secondly, what sort of information can we obtain from Aeolian sediments which give us information about changing climates and environments through time? So in this case, we're investigating vertical sequences of loess deposits in the arid Central Asian Piedmont. So to the first focus of this talk, this leads us to this first question. So how do the Silk Road dunes relate to wind regime and climate? In this case, we're going to be focusing on the dune field southeastern Kazakhstan. We're going to be working with the methods of luminescence dating to a small extent, as well as remote sensing and GIS, as well as wind and particle trajectory modelling. So in focusing on southeastern Kazakhstan, we have widespread dune fields across this region. So this is from my erstwhile master's student, Maika Novatsky. She finished her PhD about 6 months ago at Oxford, which is looking at southeastern Kazakhstan, and you can see a range of different discrete dune fields across southeastern Kazakhstan. And in this work, we had several regions of focus. The region which we can see labelled as 1 is the Semirechye region, which refers to the 7 rivers north of the northern Tian Shan. Then we have the remaining dune fields in this image, which is within the Ili River endorheic catchment, which drains into Lake Balkhash, which is shown up there in the northwestern corner of the map. And we can see widespread dune fields, particularly in the Ili River Delta, but we also see discrete dune fields occurring within the constrained Ili Valley further to the east. We also will take a little look at the so-called Moyonkum dune fields, which are not pictured here, but which are located about 300 kilometres to the west, also in the rain shadow north of the Tian Shan. So this is a region which has a high degree of topographic complexity. The Tian Shan ranges reach to Han Tengri, which is around 7,000 metres above sea level, and down to Lake Balkhash, which is sitting at about 300 metres above sea level. And we've got that complex climatic context, which we saw in the previous slides, where we have the westerlies and the northerlies, and all sorts of katabatic winds, which are playing out as a result of the high relief. Now, in this region, the dune fields are most linear in form. And by linear, I mean that we've got transverse dunes as well as longitudinal dunes, and we also have some evidence of overprinting of different dune orientations. Oopsies, sorry. So, of course, I'm a quaternarist, and so I'm interested in finding out how old these dunes were. So one of the first things which I did in my fieldwork was trying to ascertain how old these were, and I made use of luminescence dating. So far, we've been able to generate 15 ages, and this is largely because it's pretty hard to date this material. It's very young sedimentologically, and it's also really hard to sample. Access is quite difficult, it's very remote, and there are no roads. But that said, what we do have from our chronologies indicates that our dunes are pretty young. They tend to be Holocene, and we often have indications of very young activity of 1,000 years or less. And this is the case from the Moyonkum dunes across to the Taukum dunes in the Ili Delta and across to the Jalkum area in that Semirechye catchment that I mentioned before. Now, having established that the last active phases of the dune fields were relatively recent, we're now interested in looking at the dune field morphologic variability. So this work was largely undertaken by my erstwhile master's student, Maika Nowotsky. Like I said, she just finished her PhD at Oxford. So this was some years ago now. But she generated a workflow which involved automated cartography and GIS of multiple sites across the Ili dune fields. And you can see where those locations are in the top left-hand corner. So she made use of the Sentinel-2B optical satellite images and then filtered to enhance the dune swell contrast, and then undertook an object-oriented classification and segmentation by algorithm. And from this, she was able to extract out this information about dune orientations. So what patterns do we see here? So these two examples, which I've given you here, are from the Taukum area in the Ili Delta over in the northwest corner, and area D is over on the western side in the constrained part of the valley. So what we see in the Taukum area, in area A, is we've got both transverse and longitudinal dunes. They're overprinting each other. And we're also sitting quite close to the sediment epicentre of the basin. So it's highly likely that we're looking at a situation with a greater sediment supply than we have, for example, in area D over in the eastern part of the valley, where we have also much more uniform east-west orientation in the dune fields there. So this provides us with a little bit of an overview of the dune orientation. So this was calculated from bounding boxes and then analysed in aggregate to produce these, what we call dune roses, which reflect the overall orientation variability for an area. And so here we can see the 4 areas, A, B, C and D. And we can see that there's more variability in areas A and B, which are in the downstream, much more open part of the landscape. Whereas over in areas C and D, we're in the much more constrained part of the valley and we've got much more homogeneous west to east orientation in the dunes. And so it does look like the variability in the dune morphologies and orientations is highly related to the location within the basin, which is not a huge surprise, it's fairly intuitive. So how does this dune morphology relate to modern wind regimes? So here we undertook some climate reanalysis using the ERA 5 climate reanalysis dataset from the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, producing an aggregate for the period 1950 to the present. And we took a look at surface wind seasonality and speed for those 4 different areas in the Ili Basin. So in this slide, we focus on that Talcum area in the Ili River Delta, so over in that open plains area. And what we're able to do now is compare the wind regime analysis with the dune morphology. And what we see here is when we look at the wind seasonalities shown over on the left-hand side, we see that we have very prevalent, very frequent northerly winds in the autumn and winter months. And these are associated with the Siberian High and the polar jet. And these are likely to be, if we look at where that dune field is sitting relative to the river and its sandy bed load, it's likely that those frequent northerly winds are providing sediment supply to the dune fields from the river delta. On the other hand, when we look at the wind speed over on the right-hand side, we see that the strongest winds are westerlies in orientation. And this is where we have our longitudinal dunes, which are oriented largely west to east, and those transverse dunes, which are forming perpendicular to that wind vector. And so it looks like those strongest winds are determining the dune orientation. So here we're starting to hypothesize what is dictating or influencing the dune morphology with respect to the wind regimes. If we compare that previous slide from the open Talcum Delta area with the dunes from the constrained valley area that we looked at before, that area D over in the east, we see that we've got a much more homogeneous dune orientation, and we see a much more homogeneous wind regime as well. In this case, however, what we see is the strongest winds are coming very much from the west as well. So it does look like that strongest winds are influencing the dune orientation in that more sediment-starved environment. There's a very minor southerly component, and the river is sitting to the south of this area. So it looks again like that southerly component might be providing the sediment supply from the Ili River to the south. So Micah in her PhD then took this a step further and investigated the resultant sediment transport in both the observed and mapped dune orientations and with the predicted bed form orientation for both overall wind frequencies and the strongest winds. And what we observed was that, indeed, just like we saw previously, the strongest winds appeared to result in a better alignment with the observed dune orientations. One thing we also observed was that some dunes, for example, those in the constrained Ili Valley region, so over in the east there, and in the Jalkum area, so that's in the Semerecha area, do not reflect the modern winds. There does seem to be an oblique orientation difference between the dune orientations and the wind regimes. So what this suggests is that we have a change in wind regimes since the dune orientation. Now, since we have some dating, which indicates that a lot of those dunes are Holocene in age, that may mean that we've got a change in wind regime over Holocene timescales. So take-home messages from the Silk Road dunes. The orientation and the morphology of the dunes appears to reflect the strongest wind orientation. The sediment is also often sourced from the most persistent wind orientation. Another thing we've noticed is that some of those dunes do not reflect the modern winds, and this is supported by our luminescence ages. And so what this suggests is that we're likely to have a change in wind dynamics since the last phase of activity, which formed the main dune core. So now I'd like to move to the second focus of my talk, and that is looking at loess. So how does the Silk Road loess relate to wind regimes and climate? Now, in this part of the talk, we're going to expand a little bit. We're going to look at loess from Tajikistan as well as from Kazakhstan. We're going to use a wider range of techniques. So we're looking at change through time using luminescence dating and other dating techniques to provide an age model for changes and for sediment flux, as well as environmental proxies. And then we're going to be expanding that and moving into understanding how these sediment deposits provide us with links to atmospheric circulation, again using wind and particle trajectory modelling, and finally, taking a look at provenancing using trapped charge physics. Now, given that in this case we're looking at virtually continuous sedimentary deposits which are exposed as cliff faces, the only real way that you can sample these is by abseil, as you can see from this action shot from Sharon Canyon in Kazakhstan. Now, one major reason why we know so little about Central Asia's role in global climate dynamics is that we have largely overlooked the full potential of Eurasia's most widespread and most useful record of climate change, wind-blown dust, loess. So long vertical sequences of loess provide us with a valuable calendar of climate change. The hypothesis goes, if you're not familiar with it already, is that dust accumulation intensifies during cold glacial phases and decreases with soils forming under milder interglacial phases. So this tends to create a layer cake stratigraphy, which we can see from this photo from Karamaidan in Tajikistan. Now, we're interested in loess because it is widespread across this region. The Asian high mountain belts provide the ideal topography both for generating dust and for trapping it along its foothills, the Piedmonts. Now, since the loess soil packages are thought to reflect the 100,000-year glacial interglacial cycles, if we have the right kind of site, like this example from Tajikistan, we can read the climate through time, as we've got our paler primary loess units interbedded with the darker or redder paleosoil units. Now, that loess is prevalent upon the Piedmonts. That makes it quite different from the plateau loess that we see in China and Eastern Europe. Soviet scholars over decades past made significant inroads into understanding these loess formation processes and came up with polygenetic models for loess formation, which is slightly different to what we see in China and Eastern Europe. They recognised that the rivers and the alluvial fans in this region provided important conduits for sediment transfer from the high mountains, and that these mountains may or may not have been glaciated, unlike in Tibet or in the Alps of Europe. There's also a recognition that the role of deserts is likely to have been significant as a sediment epicentre and as a source for the Aeolian dust, which then got transported as loess onto the Piedmont. Now, just before I mentioned the link between loess and glacial conditions. So the stratigraphic sequences of the Central Asian loess are in a unique position to record the penetration of mid-latitude westerly airflow, which originates in the North Atlantic. Those westerly winds, which are shown here with the green arrow, transport the dust, which is picked up along the Silk Road dryland surfaces, as well as transporting moisture. The intensity and the degree of the spatial penetration of those westerlies would then be documented by the characteristics and the quantity of Central Asian loess, where the westerlies kind of fetch up onto the Asian high mountains, as shown in the brown circle there. So according to this figure, we hypothesize a mechanism which connects the North Atlantic with Central Asia, whereby we have evaporation over the North Atlantic during warmer interglacial phases, which is then transported by the westerlies to arid Central Asia, and may result in moisture compression up against the arid Central Asian mountains. Now, this increased moisture transfer to the dryland Silk Road mountains then helps to cause glacial advance at the high altitudes, as well as increased runoff into the sedimentary basins to the north of the mountains. So what we're suggesting here is that the resulting increased hydrologic connectivity perpetuates further north into Siberia, where there are huge rivers, and increases fluvial discharge into the Arctic. So that's our pale blue arrow in this diagram. So that increased fluvial discharge provides an injection of fresh water, which then reduces the salinity of the Arctic waters into the North Atlantic, thereby increasing the sea ice cover and starts to trigger colder glacial conditions. Next slides will show how this hypothesis might be supported by loess sequences along the Silk Road. So to this end, I'd like to present Sharon Canyon in Kazakhstan. This is sometimes called the Grand Canyon of Central Asia because of its spectacular scale. Sharon Canyon is an 80-metre thick deposit which is exposed in southeastern Kazakhstan. And what we see here is a sequence of aridification. The basal 20 metres is a sequence of fluvial gravels, which is then overlain by 30 metres of interbedded Aeolian loess and alluvial fans, and finally with 20 metres of entirely Aeolian environments. Our age model, which is determined by paleomagnetism and uranium-lead dating of soil carbonate nodules, because luminescence it was too old for, indicates that this sequence extends over the last 5 million years. Now, this study was led by my former postdoc, Charlotte Prudhomme, who is now at CNRS, who investigated records of moisture in Central Asia based on stable isotopes of soil carbonate nodules. Sharon Canyon is a really cool sequence which we think provides us with a key missing terrestrial link for understanding the climate system in light of that hypothesis that I showed you in the previous slide. So what we looked at here was stable carbon and oxygen isotopes. Now, in particular, the stable carbon isotopes, which are shown in the green curve there, with a running average shown in red, these provide us with a proxy for soil moisture. And what this shows is that aridification over the last 5 million years was not linear. We also have some information from clumped isotopes, which give representative paleotemperatures and which show that the stable oxygen isotopes, shown in the blue, is a mixed moisture and temperature signal. So the more straightforward story is coming from the stable carbon isotopes, and that's what I'm going to be talking about from now on. So we compared our stable carbon isotope record from Sharon Canyon with an ocean site near the Arctic. Up in the top there, that's the sea surface temperature record, which you can see up the top there, to test our hypothesis about the link between Eurasia and the Arctic and North Atlantic Oceans. So let's take a look at one particularly interesting period. So this is the mid to late Pliocene, which runs from about 4.5 to 3.3 million years ago. And the mechanism that we propose is happening at this time is shown in the top right there. So what we think is happening is that this is a time which follows the amplification of the North Atlantic current after the Panama shoaling. This is a time when the westerlies start to become much more prevalent and the Siberian high is correspondingly weak. So this means that there would have been more effective moisture transfer to arid Central Asia. Now, this increased rainfall and runoff, not only at our site, but also the enhanced fluvial discharge of the Siberian rivers further to the north, suggests that the hydrology of the Silk Road Piedmont provides us with a good proxy for those rivers further to the north. And that is this increased runoff from at Sharon Canyon, but also in Siberia, increased the sea ice volume and may have provided a terrestrial tipping point for the first major global glaciation at 3.3 million years. So the take-home message from this is that it looks like the response of the Earth's surface to long-term, so Pleistocene climate change in Central Asia, generated terrestrial feedbacks which affected ocean and atmospheric circulation on at least the hemispheric scale, which is pretty cool. Now, most of the Piedmont loess in Kazakhstan is, however, much less thick and also much younger. But it nevertheless does appear to provide valuable records of millennial scale climate change over shorter timescales. This example here is a collaboration with scientists Yue Li and Yo Guisong from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where we investigated the Nilka site in the upper Ili Valley. It's on the Chinese side of the Ili Valley. It's a record which spans 70,000 years ago through to about 14,000 years, so the last glacial cycle, more or less. And here we looked at grain-sized end-member modelling to provide a proxy for process. So in this case, we're looking at the so-called end-member 1, which is recognised to be a proxy for far-travelled dust from particularly windy periods. So this is shown here in blue, highlighted in the box. So what we have here are peaks of intensification of windy westerly events which are occurring over short time scales and which align with a number of Heinrich events which are observed, which are cold events occurring in the North Atlantic. So what this gives us an indication of is relative periods of relatively intense penetration of westerlies into the upper Ili Basin, which is not the case in the present day. So this is a pretty nice example of shorter time scale, millennial scale climatic events which are reflected and give us information about atmospheric dynamics and are recorded in the Aeolian loess. So I'd now like to just pause a bit and spend a bit of time thinking about chronologies, because these provide us with the age models for the timing of loess accumulation and changes in sediment flux through time. Now, the physical basis of this is going to become relevant later, so this is why I'm going to go into this. So luminescence dating, which we work with quite a lot, is an absolute dating technique based on the physical properties of crystalline minerals, which are natural and therefore imperfect. And therefore they contain within them defects within their crystal lattice where charge can be stored, a little bit like a battery. So exposure to sunlight by transport results in the release of stored charge and a depleted battery. Now, as the mineral grains are then deposited and buried, ionising radiation present in the surrounding sediment facilitates the trapping of charge again, and the rate at which this charge builds up is proportional to the amount of ionising radiation which is present. This is our so-called dose rate. Now, the amount of charge which is built up since burial is measured in the form of photons of light, or luminescence, and is released as the mineral grain is exposed to light in the lab, and this is radiation dose. Oopsies, again, not working so well today. So what happens when our chronologic frameworks don't fit that expected model, that dogma which we have from the Chinese and the Eastern European loess, where we've got glacial increase in loess accumulation and a decrease in accumulation rates into warmer, wetter phases? Well, this is exactly what happened to my PhD student Aditi Dave, who has now finished and is now an Ambizione Fellow at the University of Lausanne, where we generated several curious chronologies from the Ili Basin in southeastern Kazakhstan, which didn't match that model. So from here, Aditi then started looking at the sediment loess accumulation rates in the Ili Basin and compared this with sedimentation rates on the Chinese loess plateau. And what we can see in the top of this plot on the right-hand side here is what's happening in the Ili Basin. So what we see is quite a lot of spatial inhomogeneity between sites, and the timing of sedimentation peaks seems to vary from one site to another. By comparison, when we look at the Chinese loess plateau, which is the second plot on the right-hand side, we see significant spatial inhomogeneity, but we also see a pronounced peak in the last glacial maximum. Now, since the Chinese loess plateau drains the Tibetan plateau, which is strongly driven by sediments created during the glaciations of the last glacial maximum, this makes some sense. So what it looks like is happening in Central Asia is that we've got very much a patchwork loess kind of situation. So in this diagram, we started to build a model for sediment in 4 dimensions across the Kazakh Piedmont from 6 different sites, taking into account the location relative to the mountains, so where we're likely to get an increased influence of local katabatic winds versus westerly penetration, and the proximity to likely sediment sources. So what it looks like is there may be a link to climate. Sometimes in the right places, but we really need to understand the likely mechanisms which are driving sediment accumulation in response to climate at a given site. So if we choose the right site, can we then start to use or integrate models to help us to understand that climate loess link in Central Asia? So this is where we started working with atmospheric scientists, including Hartwig Harder and Sergei Gromov from the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry. And we were working with Lagrangian trajectories, so FlexPart, many of you will be familiar with this, which provide us with a way of identifying where the Aeolian sediment particles of a given grain size are likely to be coming from. Now, in this particular model, we're looking at the 20 micron size at 600 metres height. And this enables us to hypothesize links between the loess deposits and climate circulation, both in the present and into the past. So what we're looking at here is a FlexPart model for dust transport to Almaty in southeastern Kazakhstan, where we have some thick loess deposits. And what we can see is that the brightest colours, which represent the highest probability of where that dust is going to be coming from, are locally derived, but we do also have a strong westerly component, particularly in the winter months, as well as a seasonal northerly transport in the spring months. Over on the right-hand side, that plot there does have a southerly component, which we think is probably an artefact of the modelling. It's unlikely to be physically feasible because we've got some very high mountains in the way. So those models can give us a great idea of Aeolian dust transport and atmospheric circulation. But it's the sediments themselves which give us a concrete data which gives us information about where the sediments are actually coming from. So to this end, we come to the concept of provenance. So this is where we use the characteristics of source rocks to fingerprint sediment deposits. So if we can do this, we can obtain a vector for the sediment transport and therefore for the climate circulation. So for these next couple of slides, we're going to be moving back to the Tian Shan loess in Kazakhstan, where we know that we've got, from our models, that we've got westerly winds, northerly winds and local katabatic winds. So if we've got wind direction of dust transport is going to result in loess deposits which reflect the sediment characteristics of the catchment upwind. So we're working to develop a new method for provenance using trap charging quartz. So if we go back to that luminescence slide that I showed you before, if you remember that the principle of charge trapped within the defects in the crystal lattice is what luminescence is based on. Now, some of those defects, known as Frenkel-Schottky pairs, relate to different geometries in the molecular linkages of the quartz. Now, the formation of certain defect types in the quartz, known as E', appear to increase in frequency with the age of a rock. Now, you can measure this with electron spin resonance, which is a similar analytical technique to luminescence, and you can get, if you have 3 potential rock sources of different age, you'll then start to see 3 different E' signals in the quartz ISAR. Now, the location of the source relative to the deposit is then going to provide the vector for sediment transport and the links to atmospheric circulation. So Aditi, during her PhD, investigated these properties and compared loess from 2 different ends of the Central Asian high mountains, from sites in Kazakhstan in the Tian Shan Piedmont and from Tajikistan over in the southwest. And we observed striking differences. The E' intensity of the Kazakh loess is much higher, suggesting that the source rocks are likely to be older. Now, we know that rocks in the Kazakh part of the Tian Shan Mountains are definitely much older than those of the Zarafshan Mountains, which are likely to be the source of the loess in Tajikistan. So this provides us with our first proof of concept that this E' spectra thing could be used as a provenance proxy. Another proof of concept looks at modern surface samples in southeastern Kazakhstan. So this is where we've got those models of the wind regime and particle trajectory models which suggest the likely source areas. We collected surface samples from those different areas and compared that with near surface loess in southeastern Kazakhstan. And the E' intensity spectra of those different samples is shown here on the left-hand side. The modern loess is shown in grey on the right, and what we can see is that the E prime intensity of the loess is most similar to that found in area 5. So this is the area close to our loess sites, as well as in area 4, which is an area immediately to the west. Now this suggests that we've got a strong influence of both local transport and westerly wind transport. We also see some similarities with area 3 to the north, where we have our northerly winds. Now, although this is quite preliminary and we're backing this up with strontium, neodymium, radioisotope provenancing, it does appear to match the models for the dust trajectories and shows a great deal of promise. Now, ultimately, we're interested in seeing how the sediment sources may have changed through time, which gives us an insight into changes in atmospheric circulation. So here we have a preliminary investigation which looks at 2 loess down profile. So what we see here is that prior to about 10,000 years ago, the E prime values are quite similar, suggesting a similar source. Now, after about 10,000 years ago, above that line that I've just shown you, we appear to have a change in the E prime intensity, which might suggest that we've got a change in source. Now, this is still a work in progress, and we're engaging also strontium, neodymium and trace element analysis as more established provenance proxies. But the fact that we also have the evidence from the dunes, which suggests that we've got some change in wind regimes, indicates that we've got a highly promising story starting to emerge. So, just to summarise the take-home lessons from the Silk Road loess, it's really important to understand the nature of Piedmont loess formation in order to select sites for paleoclimate reconstruction. Once you've identified some great sites, at Sharon Canyon, for example, we've got Plio-Pleistocene timescales, which give us information that those loess deposits provide us with a proxy for the modulation of Northern Hemisphere moisture transfer and that missing terrestrial climate link. On late Pleistocene timescales, we've got some indications of millennial scale response at the last gasp of the westerlies, where they're sort of starting to lose energy and moving up against the Asian high mountains. And finally, the new approaches to identifying Aeolian transport pathways, integrating the modelling with the provenancing approach is pretty exciting. So finally, the take-home message that we've got from here is that from dunes we can get information about surface winds and how these are influencing morphology and how they might relate to climate. And with loess, we've got the importance of an integrated approach and understanding site formation, which provides us with a link for climate circulation. Integrating earth science techniques is really important here. So we need to engage with sedimentology, with climate proxies, luminescence dating, but we also need GIS and cartography, climate analysis and dust trajectory analysis to give us a holistic idea of what's actually going on in our Aeolian systems and what they might be telling us about past climates. And finally, I'm pretty excited about our steps towards developing that quartz-based trap charge method for provenance. Quartz is ubiquitous in terrestrial sediments, and so if it works out, it's got the potential to inform us about dust transport pathways and climate circulation through time, but also anywhere sediments are circulating, really. So with that, I'd like to say Rahmat, Sipos, Spasiba, thank you very much, and I'd like to invite any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Kat. It was an amazing talk. And we're looking here in Amsterdam for ways to attract new students. And suppose a talk like this would really attract a lot of students. Amazing fieldwork pictures and amazing work. Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Kat? To kick off the discussion, maybe I can ask a question myself. The title of your talk deals with the Aeolian process around the Silk Road, which people have been traveling more than 2,000 years. Do you know if there's any existing records of people traveling, and if you could use those maybe to reconstruct where dunes were?
I've worked in archaeological sites along the loess of the Piedmont of the Silk Road, not so much in the sand dunes, but the evidence does seem to suggest that the Piedmont loess was a bit of a climate refugium, so it was a little bit milder than the more extreme climates up in the mountains and even in the dune fields to the north. So there does appear to be some evidence to suggest that the loess Piedmonts were an area where in extreme climate phases they were preferentially an area where people liked to hang out. And when I say people, I use that fairly broadly because there is evidence that there are Neanderthal sites as well as Denisovan sites as well as modern humans. So it does look like the Silk Road also stretched back into the Paleolithic.
All right. Thanks. Any other questions? Please feel free to raise your hand or open your microphone to ask your question.
I have a question. Kat, the dune field you started your talk on with the superimposed patterns of like the different. That dune field's like a very interesting one that I've looked at on satellite imagery, but haven't been to. And I was trying to, is it a vegetated dune field? It's quite rare to find those really cool examples of such large, two large wavelength superimposed dunes. But is there any evidence from the chronology of like, if one wavelength or one pattern is younger or older than the other?
So firstly, we've got a couple of areas where this is the case. So one, we have the Moyonkum. So this is 300 kilometres further west of those Ili Basin dune fields. And that area, we really were only able to get a few kilometres in because the roads are non-existent. You really need a camel.
Is that area 2?
Pardon?
Is that area 2? Sorry.
No, it's the area in the middle of that slide there. So I've got a satellite image and it's 300 kilometres west of those areas, which are shown in the map on the right.
My mistake. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one area. And like I say, I really, really wanted to get into those overprinting dunes, but accessibility was impossible. If we then look at the Talkum area, so that's area A, which was area 3 in this map.
Yeah.
Apologies, it's 2 different studies. Here we do have overprinting, and we were able to get into an area where we could actually see overprinting, and we collected samples. It's really unconsolidated sediment, so augering does not work. You try and dig a hole and the thing just cascades in. So we were really only able to scrape the surface, but we were able to get a sample from one of the what we thought was underlying dunes. But that said, the chronology turned out to be also Holocene in age. So in answer to your first question, whether they're vegetated, they are. There's not much of a biocrust, but it's fairly sparsely vegetated. And I would describe these as semi-active dunes. Some of them are very active, some of them less so, but it's definitely not an inactive dune field like the Australian system.
Yeah, we have those sort of superimposed parabolic and longitudinal dune fields here, like the Great Victoria does it, but like that one's just so striking because they're really big. But confusing. Yeah. Well, thanks for explaining.
No, you're welcome. The other thing is that this area A is actually, it's sitting almost on a plateau, so it's sitting slightly higher than that river that you can see down to the south in that image. So I think that it's very much, the sediment supply is very much coming from the Ili River to the north and not from that river to the south, because there's just this sort of 10-meter vertical jump that the sediment would have to go up onto. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
We have a question by Bhavani. Bhavani, did you want to ask your question yourself, or should I read it for you?
Yes, I work with lake sediments. So I had just a simple query about how do the loess records or the orientation of dunes that you look at constrain like wind regimes. Wind I still understand with the orientation, but then the loess records, how do they constrain the aridity through time? Yeah.
There are a range of different proxies which we can use, and I guess the best example which we looked at in this talk was the carbonate nodules. And there are quite a lot of carbonate nodules. Some of these are quite large, and particularly in Sharon Canyon in southeast Kazakhstan, some of those nodules can be 10 centimeters across. And so those can be quite useful as a moisture proxy if you look at the stable carbon isotopes. The stable oxygen isotopes are more ambiguous. As we saw from the clumped isotopes, we were really hoping to get a much more clear signal, but it does look like that's a combined moisture and temperature proxy, so it's not so super straightforward. But the stable carbon isotopes are quite useful in that regard. Another thing that we've been exploring, or rather I should say that Charlotte has been leading this, is looking at calcite root granules. So they're calcite crystals which precipitate on the outside of the roots, and we can look at stable carbon and oxygen isotopes in those as well. The fractionation process is somewhat more convoluted and complex, and it's we published the first paper last year on that, so it's a work in progress. And another thing that people often use is malacofauna, so snails. But for that, you really need to take a look at the ecology of the snails. And then the other proxy that we can use is calcitic, so carbonate granules, which are secreted by earthworms. Unfortunately, however, although that works really nicely in Europe, none of that was preserved in the Central Asian loess, and we think that's because it's just too arid, and it's they either don't secrete large enough granules, or it's not wet enough for them to actually secrete them, these earthworms. So we weren't able to use that here, unfortunately.
Just a follow-up to that, like how much of this material do you actually find, like to reconstruct such a long time scale?
Yeah, because so with Sharon Canyon, there's quite a lot of material. I mean, you can just sort of collect a couple of carbonate nodules, and it's enough. With the calcitic root cells, you really do need to collect almost a bucket full of material. So we've got to be very careful with the actual sampling. So we sample an area of sort of 20 centimeters times 10 centimeters times 5 centimeters. And we collect it very carefully with a shovel, and we have to decontaminate between samples, and it's quite involved. And then you have to sieve it all. And then you might end up with about that much.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's quite work intensive.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Any other questions? If I may, I have another one about your grain size of the loess card you presented. And I think you mentioned somewhere with the flex part that you took the 20 micron boundary
20.
as a... Yeah, did you consider any coarser grained particles as well?
This was the very first time that we played around with FlexPart, to be fair. So since then, we've been looking at different grain sizes. So but not in the loess. So this is in Australian contexts. I'd like to explore it more. So yeah, I mean, this was really the very first time that we've done it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, sounds exciting. The math looked really promising.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Any other questions? If not the case, that's not so bad because we are nearing the hour already. And, we always aim for 1 hour. So if that's not the case, then I hope you will join me in another round of applause to thank Cap. And thanks again to everyone who tuned in for this talk. Before we go, we would like to draw your attention to this year's meeting, the ISAR, which will be held 12 to 18 July in Swakopmund, Namibia. I hope to see many of you there. You can find more information on the ISAR website, aeolianresearch.com. And we also hope to see you after summer when we will hope to continue this Virtuaeolian seminar series. And we are always looking for new speakers, so if you know someone or would like to nominate yourself for a seminar, please get in touch with us. With that, thanks for your attention. And here's another hand raised, Anastasia. Would you like to say something, Anastasia? If I can, yeah, you should be able to talk.
Yep.
Oh, there was an accident. No worries.
Clapping.
It was supposed to be applause. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, and see you hopefully soon.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.